As General Osterman surveyed the battlefield through his binoculars, the sight of dozens of burnt-out Soviet tanks and dark piles of dead Russian infantry convinced him that the time had come for a counterattack. Mannerheim was much more cautious, but he too seems to have been carried away by a new infectious spirit of optimism. At 06:30 on the 23rd of December, Finnish artillery opened up for a 10-minute barrage, behind which 3 Finnish divisions, the 1st, 4th and 6th, advanced towards the Russians. They overran Russian outposts with relative ease, but as they advanced, Russian resistance increased. Faced with an increasingly resolute Soviet defense, the Finnish divisions began to collapse into a huge, ungainly mob, unresponsive to the commands of the officers. Realizing that he had a first-class debacle on his hands, Mannerheim called off the attack. The Finns lost 1,500 men on the 23rd of December, a salutary reminder of the cost of such operations. Elsewhere, however, lightly equipped semi-trained Finnish forces were beginning to strike back at Soviet columns. In the forest vastness north of Lake Ladoga, battalions of white-clad ski troops could move rapidly around the flanks of Soviet columns, striking them from unexpected directions. From these guerrilla pinpricks, a series of increasingly impressive counterattacks began to emerge. They began immediately north of Ladoga, in the area of Tolvajärvi and Ilomantsi. On Finnish Independence Day, the 6th of December, when Finnish fortunes seemed to hit rock bottom, Colonel Paavo Talvela, an old friend of Mannerheim's, reported to the Marshal's HQ at Mikkeli. Mannerheim was brief and to the point. All Finnish forces in the Tolvajärvi-Ilomantsi corridor were henceforth designated Group Talvela. The colonel was to drive north and stabilize the situation, but this was easier said than done. When Talvela reached the front later that day, he found the Finns frightened, demoralized, and getting ready to retreat once again. Talvela realized that something had to be done quickly, in case the entire defense north of Ladoga collapsed. The best way of restoring their confidence, Talvela reasoned, was to give them a quick victory. Displaying a boldness that verged on the reckless, Talvela selected a few companies who seemed to be coping better than the rest, and just before midnight sent them across the ice of Lake Tolvajärvi to raid Russian bivouacs. By 0200 on the 7th of December, 140 Finns, whose weapons included 16 light machine guns, lay spread out along a low ridge looking down into a Russian battalion encamped around blazing fires. Rarely have troops been presented with such clear and easy targets. The Finns opened fire. A withering barrage cut through the Russian ranks for 4 minutes, reducing the clumps of men to forlorn heaps. When they stopped, there was no movement. The entire battalion had been wiped out. Russian units to the left and right flanks began firing wildly, and then at each other. The Finns slipped back across the ice to the sounds of an ever more ferocious battle, as the Russians killed each other. News of the success of the raid reinvigorated the Finns. The following day, on the 8th of December, a force operating to the north under Colonel Pa Elkholm ambushed and annihilated a Russian battalion as it attempted to find its way out of a frozen bog. With success like this, Talvela felt confident enough to order a general counterattack. For the next 2 days, the Finns kept attacking along the flanks of the strung-out Russian units. The temperature was now -25 degrees. The snowdrifts were deep and solid, and the Russians had no skis. As the Finns swept around them, the Russians tried to hit back with tactical airstrikes, which helped Soviet morale but had little chance of locating their well-camouflaged enemy. Late on the 21st of December, 2 companies of Finns crossed the ice of Lake Tolvajärvi to attack the village of Olgajärvi from the north. 2 companies attacked from the south. The Russians had turned each building into a strong point, and every one had to be destroyed in turn with grenades, Molotov cocktails, and satchel charges. It was a bloody and exhausting business, but by 1400 hours the Russians were in retreat. The Finns pressed on for 2 more days, reaching the Itojoki River on the 23rd of December, when Mannerheim called off the attack. Since the beginning of the offensive on the 7th of December, Talvala's force of 6,000 men had suffered 2,000 casualties, of whom 630 had been killed. The Finns counted more than 4,000 Russian bodies, and estimated that at least another 5,000 had been wounded, of whom some 600 had become prisoners. Further south, along the northern shore of Lake Ladoga, General Haglund launched a counter-offensive against the Soviet 168th Division, which was spread out along dozens of kilometers of snowbound road. As Finnish ski troops swept around the Russian flanks, chopping into the columns in elongated pockets, the Russian troops deployed for all-round defense and began digging in. By the second week in January, Russian columns had been cut into 11 pockets, known to the Finns as motis. Haglund barely had enough men to maintain a permanent presence at each moti, and instead conducted a mobile siege, with ski troops keeping the Russians off balance through a series of hit-and-run attacks. Most motis were too powerful to attack directly. They contained scores of tanks, hundreds of guns, and the men could survive for a time by eating their horses and by supply drops from the Soviet Air Force. The Finns set up anti-aircraft guns around the motis and sometimes succeeded in duplicating Russian signals requesting logistic drops, so that the supplies came floating down to their own rather than the Soviet positions. The Russians attempted to supplement the airdrop by bringing in supplies across Lake Ladoga at night, but these columns were frequently ambushed by Finnish ski patrols. As Soviet supplies dwindled, pocket after pocket was faced with the choice of surrendering to the Finns or attempting to break out. Invariably, they chose the latter course. The 3,600 Russians inside the East Lameti moti came charging out in mid-January, hoping to overwhelm the single battalion besieging them, but ran into withering machine gun fire. After the massacre, the Finns counted more than 3,000 Russian dead, including a Soviet general who was surrounded by the bodies of 4 female typists, each clutching a rifle. By the end of January, 8 of the 11 motis along the northern shore of Lake Ladoga had fallen to General Haglund's forces. During December, the news from Finland had been greeted in the Kremlin with disquiet, then alarm, and finally rage. In late December, Stalin met with his military chiefs. The Soviet leader was painfully aware that the world was comparing his own failure to defeat Finland with Hitler's rapid destruction of Poland 3 months earlier. He ordered the execution of some of the officers who had failed, but there was to be no wholesale bloodletting. Stalin knew that the poor performance of the Soviet army was partly due to his own purge of senior and middle-ranking officers. He was a survivor, and his response to the crisis was pragmatic. The Leningrad military district that had been conducting the campaign was reorganized and became the Northwestern Army Group, or Front. To command at the operational level, Stalin chose General Semyon Konstantinovich Timoshenko, a former barrel maker, who had proved an effective army commander in the short Polish campaign. Timoshenko's first step was to reorganize the Northwestern Front, creating 2 armies, 7th and 14th. Once he established a new command structure, he moved in fresh divisions. Like Meretskov before him, he identified a 16-kilometer wide corridor at Sumy as the best place to effect a breakthrough. Here, he assembled 10 infantry divisions, 5 tank brigades, and 2,800 guns, enough artillery to give him a front-wide ratio of 50 guns per kilometer.